This recording is going to cover epithelial tissue. This is one of our 4 primary tissue types. The epithelial tissues are tissues that line internal body cavities, passageways. They cover the external surface of your body. They're also part of our glands. Now, depending on where we're located, we're going to use a different type of epithelial tissue. But it's just give you some, besides what I just said, some general locations that you'll find be a little bit more specific, is the epithelial tissues are actually part of different membranes. So one of the membranes it's part of is this here, is called the serous membranes, which we've talked about previously. Your serous membranes line ventral body cavities, and these are cavities that are closed to the exterior. So this included your peritoneum, your pleura, your pericardium. Now remember, the serous membranes had 2 layers, a parietal layer and a visceral layer. The visceral layer covered organs, and the parietal layer lined the cavities. Remember, I had mentioned it lines body cavities, and it also covers things. Now the mucous membranes are membranes that are lines cavities that are open directly to your exterior. So you'll find mucous membranes is part of your digestive tract, your urinary, your reproductive, and your respiratory tracts. Now the mucous membranes, the epithelial tissue that we see, will vary depending on where we are. So the epithelial tissue, say, in your lining your esophagus, is different from what you'd find, say, in your small intestine. So it all depends on where you are. The serous membranes, the epithelial tissue is the same. We'll cover that a little bit later, what type of epithelium you would find there. The epithelial tissues also, we said, covers external surfaces of your body. So it is referred to as your cutaneous membrane or your skin. So that covers the external of your body. Now, epithelial tissues are also part of your synovial membranes that are associated with your synovial joints. Epithelial tissues are also part of the glandular tissues of your body. And we have what we call exocrine glands and endocrine glands. The difference between them is exocrine glands secrete something through a duct technically to the exterior surface of the body, and that can include things like releasing digestive enzymes. It could be a sweat gland releasing sweat. Endocrine glands, they don't utilize ducts. They secrete usually we refer to as hormones into tissue fluids and the blood. Now the epithelial tissues are associated with the ducts as well as the glands themselves. And just give you some pictures, just give you some examples of some glands, is up here. This here is the thyroid gland, and in the center is what we refer to as your parathyroid gland, which I'm just going to abbreviate it. Those are endocrine organs. They release, parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone, thyroid gland releases your T3 and T4. Those are endocrine glands. On the left, this here is a section through your pancreas. Now the pancreas is unique, not unique, but it's interesting in that it has an exocrine as well as an endocrine component. Most of what you see in the pancreas out here, these cells are part of the exocrine component. They produce digestive enzymes. Now in the center here, this is what we call an islet, or a pancreatic islet. This produces insulin and glucagon, which are hormones involved in controlling blood glucose levels. So that's an endocrine component of the pancreas. On the far right, you see a sweat gland, which is an exocrine gland, and over here, this is a section through a salivary gland, which is an exocrine gland. Now, functions of epithelial tissues will vary depending on what particular type of epithelium that we have. They do serve some of them will serve a protective role, specifically ones that are more stratified, that you see, say here, lining the esophagus, or the stratified type that we see lining the urinary bladder. But they also are involved in absorption and secretion and in excretion and sensory reception. But I want to kind of make sure you understand the difference between absorption, secretion, and excretion. Say here, this is a picture kind of looking at inside the kidney tubule where you have the epithelial tissue here in the white is over here would be, if it stayed in here, would be the urine. Well, you have some of the stuff that's filtered by the glomerulus into the nephron tubules. Some of it we want to recapture because it's relatively non-specific, so things like glucose you want to get back. So we would actually call it reabsorption because it was already absorbed previously, say, in the intestine. But absorption, you're taking a substance through the surface into body fluids or tissues. Secretion is the opposite. It's a process of releasing something, so you kind of go in the opposite direction. So another example to showing you absorption and secretion is here showing you absorption, where you're seeing glucose being absorbed from the intestinal lumen because you just digested food and you're going it into the cell and eventually into the bloodstream. On the left is showing you secretion, where we're secreting insulin. So those islet cells, they're called the islets of Langerhans, will release insulin into your bloodstream, and that's going to be involved in regulation of blood glucose levels. Now, excretion is kind of the direction is similar to secretion. The difference is with excretion is you pretty much the material is removed from the body in some way, shape, or form to either regulate the composition of your body fluids, your tissues, or somehow expelled to the exterior surface to perform some sort of function. So, example, when you sweat. So that helps to cool yourself, but also sweat can contain some waste products. Urination, this poor puppy needs to go to the bathroom, is urine has waste products in it. Feces, when you defecate, has waste products, so that would be more excretion. Now, before we kind of look at the different types of epithelial tissues, I do want to talk about some characteristics of epithelial tissues. Now, one of the things that epithelial tissues are when you compare them to any other tissue type is they're very cellular. They exhibit what we refer to as cellularity. Is when you look at them, you see mostly cells. Cell, 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 cell. There's not a lot of stuff between them. Over here on the slide, I'm going to highlight the epithelial tissue. So it's the lining, the covering. Here's the epithelial tissue. You see just cell, 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 cell. So it's very cellular. That's going to be way different when you look at the connective tissues. Now, another thing that epithelial tissues exhibit is polarity. Now, polarity is where you have different surfaces. You have an apical surface, which you see up here, which is free. It's not attached. It's either opens to an internal space or the outside, and then you have a basal surface, which is connected to something. It's anchored to, referred to as the basement membrane. So on this slide, what I showed you previously, here is the apical surface. Down here is the basal surface. On the slide below, the apical surface is here. It's lining the lumen. So in here would have been maybe eventually could have been some urine in there. And out here is the basal surface. It's attached. And here's some connective tissue out here. This is connective tissue here. Another thing that is what you'll notice about epithelial tissues is you will never find a blood vessel within epithelial tissues. The blood vessels are actually found in the underlying connective tissues. So the lack of blood vessels they refer to as the epithelial tissue being avascular. Most other tissues are pretty well vascularized. When we do connective tissues, I'll give you some examples of where things are not vascular, but most connective tissues are very well vascularized. So these don't have a blood vessels, but they do need to get nutrients and oxygen, and they actually get it from these blood vessels in the underlying connective tissues, so they get it by diffusion. Now, as long as you're getting the nutrition that it needs from those underlying connective tissues, or say the blood vessels there, is epithelial tissues have a very high regenerative capacity. So you notice here someone has a sunburn. Many of us have had sunburns before or burned yourself, and we'll notice shortly after, a few days later, eventually the skin peels. But at some point, it all regenerates, and you never even knew you had a burn there, because they're actively mitotic epithelial tissues, and so they're always regenerating. And just to give you an example how regenerative skin is, and we can use that to our advantage, is some people get really bad burns where they actually need a little bit help to try to kind of recover from the burns, is now they do something called spray-on skin. So here's a boy who had hot tea accidentally poured on him. So he had second-degree burns. So it went all the way through his top layers, his epidermis, which is epithelial tissue, down into the dermis of the skin, which is connective tissue. And what they did is they took some cells from his skin, other parts of the skin, grew them in a laboratory setting. They regenerated, and then they sprayed it on him. And you could barely tell he was ever burned. So that's something that's very commonly used now. It's called spray-on skin. Another thing I do want to mention, though, before we move on, is I want to look at some things that we'll notice with epithelial tissue, some modifications of the apical surface, plus also a cell that I want to see that's associated with epithelial tissues. Is one of the modifications that you see on the apical surface is something called microvilli. Microvilli allow to have increased surface area for absorption. So things like in the intestine, this is very beneficial because a lot of digestion, you digest your food and you need to absorb a lot of stuff, so you have this microvilli there that increases surface area for absorption. Another thing that is a free surface modification that does increase surface area for absorption is something that's called stereocilia. And it seems kind of odd why they call it stereocilia. I'm going to mention very shortly why they called it. Stereocilia is found in something called the epididymis, and the epididymis is right here, kind of this coiled structure on top of each testes in the male. Now, the epididymis is an area where sperm mature. Sperm are actually made in the testes here, and a lot of it gets brought up into the epididymis and use a lot of fluid to help draw up that sperm. And so while it's sitting there in the epididymis, in maturing, we need to absorb that fluid. And these structures that you see here, called stereocilia, are involved in absorption. Now, they called it stereocilia because right here, cilia is another modification of the apical surface, and cilia are structures that are modal. And when they initially looked at this, they thought it was cilia, but in fact, these things are not modal. So it just kind of kept the cilia as part of their name, but they're called stereocilia. So it's just involved in absorption. Other things I want to show you is it's actually a cell, and we have this unicellular gland called the goblet cell. The goblet cell got its name because it resembled like a water goblet, and you see all these little clear areas, these clear circle areas. Those are goblet cells. Here's a goblet cell. Here's a goblet cell. Here's one over here. These are one-cell glands. They secrete mucus, and that mucus has a number of different functions depending on where you are in your body. Now, another thing that I want to mention is what you see right here. This is actually cilia. So cilia actually move. They propel material. So for example, to kind of show you a function of mucus and cilia at the same time, is this goblet cell secretes mucus, and if you have particles up here, it traps it, and the cilia will move and propel those trapped particles. Now, if this actually is a section through your trachea, and if you inhaled something and it had some particles in it, they could damage your very delicate epithelium that you find in the respiratory membrane. Is we want to trap it and get rid of it. But it can also trap pathogens and larger materials, and so the mucus traps it, the cilia propel it, and that's going to propel it up to your up to the point where you can swallow that, and it hits the stomach acid and kills it or destroys it. So what we're going to do first is kind of tell you basically how we're going to classify the epithelium. We do two things. We look at how the cells are arranged, how many layers or how it appears, or the shape of the cells. So the first one is simple. So simple is one layer of cells. Stratified is more than one layer. Two or more, that's considered stratified. Now you'll notice I've incorporated this other one. Pseudostratified epithelium is simple. It is only one layer, but it appears to be more than one layer, and I'll go over that a little bit more in depth when we get there. But right now, just think about simple and stratified. The other way we're going to look at is the shape of the cells. The first one we call squamous. The cells are flat. If they're cuboidal, they're cube-shaped. Think of shaped like an ice cube. And the last type we call columnar. They're column-shaped. So column-shaped cells, think of rectangular. They're taller than they are wide. And what you'll notice is the nuclei of these cells tend to be at the lower half of the cells. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at all the types of simple epithelium. So these are epithelial tissues with only one layer of cells. So the first one is simple squamous epithelium. So this is one layer, or one row, you can say row or layer, of thin, flat cells. Some will say if you look at from up above, the apical appearance is they look like fried eggs. Is the yolk is the nucleus at the center, and then you have the egg, which is kind of irregular around it. So some people will say it kind of looks like fish scales or whatever, but they're flat cells. Then from the side view, which you see here, very flat, and the nuclei are flat. Now this type of epithelium, being very thin in one layer, is very good if you want to move things across relatively quickly. So they're very good for any type of diffusion like gases, osmosis, which is movement of water, filtration, secretion, and also mention about this reducing friction, because a little bit of review of what we've talked about in the past. So places that you're going to see is one of them would be in the alveoli. Okay, so alveoli of your lungs. Now this is for gas exchange. You want gases to move very quickly across the membrane, so you want one layer of flat cells. Other parts that you're going to see is in parts of your kidney tubules. Now, and I say parts because it depends on what part. Here, though, I want to show you first, this is actually a section through the lung, and all this here is the simple squamous epithelium. It's very cellular. All this would be air in there. Now, I said another place would be within the kidney tubules, which are located up here within the kidneys, and the functional unit of the kidneys are called nephron tubules, and depending on what section you look at, the type of epithelium varies. But the simple squamous are going to be found within generally the thin segments of your loop of Henle. You don't have to worry about trying to write down all the different components of the nephron tubule. That's something you do in AMP2. But this just kind of give you an example of why it's flat here versus what you see in these other places. Is the only thing that takes place, there's very little goes on in these parts of the nephron tubule, and specifically like the descending limb of the loop of Henle, which has squamous cells. The only thing that's happening is osmosis. There's the movement of water. There's non-movement of anything else. No glucose, no sodium, no nothing else. And in order for those other things to be moved across, you need transport proteins. Well, in order to make those transport proteins, you need organelles. And so areas that you have to be able to make a lot more transport proteins, the cells are going to be bigger, so they're not going to be flat, they're going to be more cuboidal. And in other places where you need a lot more, you're going to have column-shaped cells. So here, not much going on, so the cells don't need a lot of room, a lot of space. So that's where a place that you'll find them. Other place that you'll find simple squamous epithelium is certain locations where actually they're going to have a special name for it. You must use that special name. Even though when you look at the epithelium, it's one layer of flat cells, but they have a certain name to them, and you have to use it because these cells are actually biochemically different than, say, the simple squamous epithelium you see here in the loop of Henle or even in the alveoli of the lungs. So it is part of serous membranes, and actually the epithelial tissue that we find there is actually referred to as mesothelium. Okay, so mesothelium is the epithelial component of serous membranes, again, which line internal body or ventral body cavities. So remember, it's part of the pericardium, the pleura, and the peritoneum, both the visceral and the parietal layers. Other place that is, special type of simple squamous epithelium is referred to as endothelium. Endothelium lines blood vessels as well as lymphatic vessels in the inside of your heart. So here's actually a section through the heart. So you can see here, this is where like the chamber of the heart, where the blood would be, is you'll notice endothelium is part of referred to as the endocardium of the heart. So there is endothelium here. Out here, at least, you can also see as part of the pericardium, you have the visceral and the parietal layers, and again, you'll see, notice it says mesothelium. It says mesothelium. Okay, but endothelium is simple squamous epithelium that lines your blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and the chambers of your heart. Now, moving on to simple cuboidal epithelium. This has a single row or layer of cube-shaped cells. These are definitely very good for absorption and secretion. You think about it, not really good for protection. Only one layer. Same way with the simple squamous. One layer cells, not going to protect you very much. But these are good, one layer, very good for secretion absorption. You're going to find this type of epithelium in parts of the nephron tubule again. So you see it here in this proximal convoluted tubule. You got collecting duct cells, distal convoluted tubule. So you can just write parts of the kidney tubules. You can say kidney tubules, or you can say nephron tubules, because that's the functional unit in the kidney called nephrons. Another place that you're going to have it is in your thyroid gland, which you see right here, the anterior surface, kind of front of your trachea. And the thyroid gland produces T3 and T4, your thyroid hormone. So it's definitely going to be involved in secretion. And you secrete those hormones, but you need to absorb things to be able to make it. So both of them are involved in secretion and absorption. Now here's a slide through the kidneys, and this particular part shows you the simple cuboidal epithelium. And what you're going to look for is, you'll notice in cross section, the simple cuboidal epithelium appears as a ring of cells. So here is your ring of cells. The cells are square shaped, and the nucleus is relatively large and round. Okay, so that's what you're going to look for. Now the other type we're going to look at is simple columnar epithelium. So this one, you got a single layer or row of column-shaped cells. Now this one, what you'll also notice is the nuclei tend to be more oblong-shaped, and they're going to be at the lower half of the cell. So these cells are taller than they are wide. So these are also good for absorption and secretion. And where applicable, if these are ciliated, it will be moving. The cilia will move things across the surface. So the simple columnar epithelium, we actually have two types. One type is referred to as the ciliated type. These are found, there's two different names for this structure, fallopian tube or uterine tube. So this helps to propel an egg down the fallopian tube down towards the uterus. And this is actually a section through the fallopian tube. There's more than one type of epithelium. There's a ciliated type and there's a non-ciliated. So the ciliated type helps to move the egg down. The non-ciliated type of simple columnar epithelium we're going to find in parts of our digestive tract, specifically your stomach, your small intestine, and your large intestine. You also see this in the gallbladder too, but you don't have to write that down. Now this type, definitely we think digestive tract absorption of, say, nutrients, secretion of like mucus or digestive enzymes, things like that. So they're definitely good for absorption and secretion. So again, for this type of epithelium, is you're looking for a tall rectangular cell. So here's this tall rectangular cell that's getting taller than they're wide. The nucleus tends to begin at the lower half of the cell. So here again, this is the epithelial tissue. This is actually a section through the small intestine. Now the last type of simple columnar epithelium, it actually we refer to as pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now the cells are column shaped, that's where it got its name, but it's pseudostratified. Pseudo means false. It's falsely stratified. So you have a single layer of cells that appear to have more than one layer. And so the reason why it appears to have more than one layer, if you look at it, you see the nuclei are at different levels. So it gives that false appearance of being stratified. However, each cell is, and it's just one layer cell, is attached to the basement membrane. So here's a cell right here. It goes just to here. And then you have this one next to it that goes all the way up here. And so they don't share a common apical surface, but they all, one layer cells, all attached to the basement membrane. So it looks falsely stratified, but it's only one layer. Now, pseudostratified columnar epithelium, you can have it in two types. It can be ciliated or non-ciliated. So these ones are going to be involved in secretion of substance, like, again, you can see a lot of goblet cells with this, protection, and it has to do with the mucus. And so I'll give you some examples here in a moment. So first one, so we're going to see a lot more of, is the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which is often abbreviated as PCCE. Makes it a little bit easier. Well, places that you're going to see is in the upper respiratory tract. So you start up here in the nasal cavity. Other part is the first part of your pharynx. Right here is your nasopharynx. You got here is your trachea. And then down here you have bronchi. Those are actually part of your lower respiratory tract. So large parts of your respiratory tract have PCCE. Now the goblet cells that you will see as part of this epithelium secrete mucus, and the cilia will beat and propel anything that's been trapped in the mucus. So it's more protective there. It's protecting the alveoli down here from getting any type of pathogens or debris that could harm them. Now the non-ciliated type is, we'll see in a moment, but here's a section through the trachea, and actually it's showing you here's PCCE. So here you see here's a goblet cell right there. You can see at least the goblet cell there, and here's the cilia right there. Now the pseudostratified columnar epithelium that's non-ciliated, you'll see in, say, example again, the epididymis, which I had mentioned previously. So remember, this is stereocilia. It is not cilia, so it's not motile. So it's actually considered a non-ciliated type. In lab, we predominantly look at this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Now we're going to look at your stratified epithelium, the epithelial tissues with more than one layers of cells. Now, I'm only going to show you, or I should say, I'm not going to show you stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar. However, I do want to mention that if the naming, stratified squamous or cuboidal or columnar, all comes from the shape of the cells at the top layer. Okay, so when I'm going to show you stratified squamous, I'm going to show you that the shapes of the cells will vary depending on the layers, but the naming comes from the shape of the top layer of cells. So I'm not going to show you those stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar epithelium. So I'm going to show you stratified squamous epithelium first. So we do have more than one type, but overall when you look at stratified squamous, is you're looking for multiple layers, okay, multiple layers of cells. that are in the top layers are squamous or flat. So we're going to say the top layer. Because I'm going to show you, if you just look at the diagrams, is you start here like, well, these are more cuboidal shape. But when you look up here, the top layers are squamous. So the naming comes from the appearance of the top layers of cells. Now, the stratified squamous epithelium, or the stratified type of epithelium, is very good for protection. There's multiple layers. Especially with stratified squamous, you have multiple layers of cells. But we have two different types. We have a keratinized and a non-keratinized type. So first one I want to mention is what we call stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. This type of epithelium are going to be found in parts of the digestive tract, but not small intestine, large intestine. Here it's like when the food first comes in. So oral cavity, so your mouth, your tongue, and this part of your pharynx, your oral pharynx, laryngeal pharynx, because food goes there and also air, but the nasopharynx is just air. So you need more protection when you're actually swallowing food because it could abrade or away the epithelial lining. Also the esophagus, because the food's going to go down to the stomach. Once you hit the stomach, the epithelium will change. Other places when it's exiting is the anus. So, and actually in the junction between the rectum and the anus, you have it too. So you need multiple layers of cells, and it's protective. Now these cells are, the non-keratinized epithelium is in places that are moist. Other place that you'll notice that you'll find this type of epithelium in an adult female in the vagina. Okay, so areas that could be exposed to a lot of friction, a lot of abrasion. Now these type of cells, though, when you look at them, so you'll notice here multiple layers of cells. These top layer cells, you'll notice, are flat. But what you're looking for is the presence of nuclei throughout the layers. These cells all living all the way up at the top. Now this will differ from when we look at the keratinized type. Now the keratinized type you find in the epidermis of your skin. So this is a model of the skin, and the epidermis is just this part right here. Okay, so the epidermis of skin, this is protecting you against the outside environment from pathogens, a lot of different things. So these, you have a lot of layers of expendable cells. Now the difference is these top layers here are all dead. They're filled with keratin, which is a protein which helps to toughen the skin and make it relatively water resistant. Now when you look at it on a microscope slide, here's the epithelium right here. These cells here are living. You see nuclei here. They're actually all derived from this bottom layer of cells. But as the cells move up, they fill with keratin, which again toughens it up, helps it become more water resistant. By the time it reaches up here, all these cells here are dead. There are no nuclei in them. So the top layers of cells are dead. So when you can look at keratinized versus non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, you look for the presence of nuclei in those top layers of cells. So here we find it in the skin. Now the last type of stratified epithelium I want to mention today is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium has the appearance of, it has many layers of cells. That thing is those cells will change shape in response to tension. So if I want to give you an example, this could be found in the urinary bladder. Here's a bladder that is not filled with urine. It's relaxed. What you'll notice is it appears to have a variety of cell shapes. You start with cuboidal down here, starts to look more columnar, and then the top has these dome-shaped cells. Well, when the bladder's filled up with urine, these top layer of cells, these are actually called dome cells. Here, they're dome-shaped cells, will transform into more of a squamous type. So it very closely, when the bladder is stretched, this type of epithelium has been stretched, will resemble a stratified squamous non-keratinized, but only when stretched. So this type of epithelium is definitely protective, multiple layers. So if you think about the bladder, which is filled with urine, which has metabolic waste products in it. But you want these type of cells to be distensible, be able to be stretched, but then allow it to resume its original shape after urine is expelled. So these cells have the ability to change shapes, and you don't see that with the stratified squamous epithelium. Those top layer cells are always going to be flat and never going to appear dome-shaped. Now what I do is, to make it a little bit easier on students, is I always will show them the example of transitional epithelium where it's not been stretched, it's been relaxed. Now you're going to find this in your urinary bladder. Okay, so you find it in the urinary bladder. You're going to find it in here, the ureters. You also find it in portions of, you can see here, this is a male, portions of the urethra. Oop, got a T. So parts of the urethra. Now the, here, just to show you kind of what it looks like, is from here out is your epithelium. See, you see multiple layers, has a lot of different shapes, but you look here, these dome cells. This is a relaxed bladder that you're seeing. Okay, so that's what you see with transitional epithelium. Now this is the end of the recording for epithelial tissue. Again, I'm not going to show you stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar. A little bit harder or a little bit rarer, so I did the more common type of epithelial tissues.